Well, we've been sharing a series of messages we started a couple, more than a couple weeks ago now, but we've shared a couple of sermons on setting the standard. We talked about living up to the standard of God's Word in our lives. We talked about, the last message was talking about setting the standard of excellence in our lives. Today I'd like to talk about setting the standard of grace. You know, we've heard more than we want to hear about the COVID virus, haven't we? Just about done with that. Well, we're not going to talk about that this morning, but we are going to talk about a different kind of virus, and it's a relational virus that attacks every friendship, every relationship. You know, as you've all recognized, if you're gone through life at all at any age, you've realized that in relationships, wrongs are done. People wrong you. They offend you. Lies are told. Trust is broken. Since we're imperfect people, we're bound to have trouble with forgiveness. Anybody have trouble with forgiveness? Sometimes that's a very hard thing to do, isn't it? The hard thing to do is to show grace. Same thing that what God did to us when He showed grace to us. We didn't deserve it. We didn't earn it. But He showed us grace. We're to show that same grace to others. I think relationships are built not on a standard of perfection. And we ought to be thankful for that. Even though we may expect it in others, we would never want it to have them expected of us, to expect perfection. But relationships are built on the ability, I think, to first of all ask for forgiveness, and upon the willingness on our part to extend forgiveness. To ask for forgiveness and to extend forgiveness. Grace has to impact both our friendships and our forgiveness. We Christians, I think, need to set the standard in our culture when it comes to showing grace. We need to set the standard. It's not easy to ask for forgiveness. And it's certainly not easy to extend forgiveness to those who have wronged us or offended us. Proverbs 18:19 says this. It says, a brother wronged is more unyielding than a fortified city. Disputes are like the barred gates of a citadel. Someone has said, forgiveness is the virtue we most enjoy but least employ. Unfortunately, that's probably true. We struggle with forgiveness because it's not really natural. And our sense of justice always wants to be vindicated. Somebody offends us, they wrong us, we want to be vindicated. We want them to have to pay for their injustice. You know, one day Peter came to Jesus and he asked Jesus a question. And it's found in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 21. He said, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother who sins against me? Up to 7 times? I think Peter was trying to discover a formula, a mathematical formula for grace. And we know that that just isn't, there is no mathematical formula. We all have barriers that keep us from giving that gift of forgiveness to others around us. We have a threshold that we don't want to cross. We've got a limit that we don't want to go beyond when it comes to forgiveness. And let me remind you this morning of 3 barriers of an unforgiving heart that I think we all struggle with from time to time. The first one is revenge. That's a barrier to our forgiveness, forgiving others. We have the idea of, well, I want to get even. Or they need to pay for what they've done. So the first barrier is revenge. The second barrier is resentment. Kind of the attitude, I'm just going to stay angry. I'm just going to hold on to this thing. I'm going to show them, right? We think when we do that, we're hurting that person, but really we're only hurting ourselves. And the third barrier is remembering. Like, you know, we say, I'm never going to forget it. Well, I forgive you, but I'm never going to forget it. Peter wanted Jesus to help him set some forgiveness limits. That's what he was all about. He wanted to know where it would be okay to just say, okay, that's it. You've messed up one too many times. Peter responded to his own question by suggesting that 7 times that'd be a good limit. I think Peter probably was thinking, he was really being pretty big to saying, how many times do we forgive? 7 times even? Forgiving someone 7 times is pretty commendable, I'd say, wouldn't you? Most of us get frustrated if we have to forgive someone the 2nd time. Peter wanted a number. He wanted a limit, a place where he could finally say, that's it, you're not getting away with this any longer. Our friendship is over. But Jesus' answer was unexpected. And it was a little disarming because Jesus said to Peter, he said, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Now, I don't believe Jesus is suggesting that we keep track. Okay, that was number 37. All right. That's number 38. You're getting close, okay? I don't think he was suggesting that we count the number of times we forgive somebody. I think 77 means that there is no limit to the number of times that we're to forgive. We don't keep score, in other words, when it comes to forgiveness. Just like grace, forgiveness has about it that maddening quality because it's undeserved, it's unmerited, and it's unfair. You think about it sometimes when you have to forgive somebody, it's kind of unfair. Because you have to truly forgive them and say, you don't owe me anything. The debt is paid. Aren't you glad Jesus did that for us? Don't get too excited now this morning, okay? Just stay in your seats, okay? Don't go jumping around or anything. Now, since the truth of forgiveness without limits is hard for you and I to grasp, Jesus told a story to help illustrate what he meant. In the first half of the story that Jesus told, he deals with those of us who need forgiveness. There are times that we need forgiveness. We've done something to someone or some people that we need forgiveness for. And he gives us some practical help for those times when we've wronged someone and we stand in need of their forgiveness. And in the second half of the story, he targets those of us who need to forgive someone else, who need to forgive others. Those times when somebody has wronged us or somebody has offended us, when they're in dire need of our forgiveness. And in verses 23 and 24, we read this. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Now, this to me is just an amazing part of the story because the servant owed him, in our day and age, our equivalent of like about $25 million. That's what they say it comes to. Now, I'm not sure exactly how he ever rang up that kind of a debt. He must have taken some cue from America. I'm not sure exactly how he did run up that debt, but it's clear that he would never be able to repay the king. There's no way that he could repay this debt. And in verse 25, we read this. The master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. So what happens? At this point, the servant falls down on his knees and he says in verse 26, be patient with me and I will pay back everything. I don't know how he's going to do it, but he says, just be patient with me and I'll pay back everything. And for some reason, the king was moved with compassion. And he did something that the man didn't even ask for. If you think about this now, the king not only releases him from that debt, but he forgives the debt. He doesn't say, yeah, okay, I'll give you X amount of time to pay it back. But he says, your debt is forgiven. And the servant owes him nothing. That, folks, is exactly what forgiveness is all about. When we forgive someone, they don't owe us anything. They don't have to pay us back. They don't have to do anything. To forgive is to cancel the debt. Okay? Whether we've wronged someone and they choose to forgive us, or I should say when we've wronged someone and they choose to forgive us, they are in essence saying, I cancel your debt. You don't owe me anything. I release you from ever having to pay me back. Now understand that the servant didn't deserve this forgiveness. He didn't do anything to deserve it. It was unmerited. It was purely an act of grace. It was an act of mercy on the part of the king. Does that remind you of our King Jesus? He gave us forgiveness. We didn't deserve it. We didn't merit it. Let me give you 3 action steps. If you're in need of forgiveness this morning, if you're in need of forgiveness, okay? Number 1, action step. Face the person that you've wronged. Sometimes this is a tough step to take. But to just face the person that you've wronged. Meet with them. Whether it's a friend or a foe, face to face, meet with them. In Matthew 5:24, Jesus in essence put it this way. If your brother has something against you, go and be reconciled to your brother. He says, even before you worship, be reconciled to your brother. Reconciliation even takes precedence over our worship, he's saying. In other words, it doesn't do much good if we come and we try to worship God, but we've got unforgiveness. Or somebody has not, we've done something and offended somebody, and we need to ask for forgiveness. Secondly, action steps number 2 is we need to own up to any wrong that we've done. Again, that's a difficult step for some of us because we're full of pride. We don't like to own up to what we've done wrong. I've played a lot of basketball in my day. I think my day is gone, but in basketball and some other sports, when you make a bad, say basketball, you make a bad pass or you miss a shot or you you foul somebody, the first thing we oftentimes say is, my bad, my bad. What are we doing? We're owning up to our mistake. We're saying it's our fault. It's not enough sometimes, folks, just to acknowledge our mistakes, but we need to own up to them. Not just say, yeah, I made a mistake, but to just own up to say, it's my fault, my bad. I've done wrong. And then step number 3, we need to ask for release. We need to actually say the words, please forgive me. Please forgive me. I was wrong. And it's important to be released from that debt that we owe. I would ask you today, who might you need to face this week? Who might you need to go face to face with? What wrong do you need to own up to in your life? Do you have the courage to ask for release from the debt that you have? Now, let's talk about those times when we need to forgive others. Let's go back to the story that we were reading. And as this man walks away from the king with this wonderful gift of forgiveness. He runs into a friend who owes him some money. It wasn't a lot of money. In comparison to the $25 million that he owed the king, what this guy owed him was like about $10. Okay? But instead of canceling his friend's debt, he says he grabs the man and he begins to choke him and he says, pay back what you owe me. Now, I think sometimes we look at that story and we say, how could he do that? How could he do that? He's just been forgiven that huge debt. How can he do that? Well, I get a kick out of one of the poets. Heinrich Heine wrote this. He said, my nature is the most peaceful in all the world. All I ask is a simple cottage, a decent bed, good food, some flowers in the front of my window, and a few trees beside my door. Then if God wanted to make me completely happy, he would let me enjoy the spectacle of 6 or 7 of my enemies dangling from those trees. I would forgive them all the wrongs that they have done me from the bottom of my heart, but we must forgive our enemies, but not until they're hanged. Now, I know it's kind of a crude illustration, but I think you get the point this morning. We want to see people pay for the wrong that they do. When someone does something wrong, we want to see them punished. We want to be vindicated. We want them to pay for the offense that they've done to us. Well, in our story, the forgiven man's friend falls to his knees and he asks for the same thing that this man had asked for from the king. His plea was almost identical to this other man's when he fell before the king. He said, "Be patient with me and I will pay you back." But instead of forgiving out of simple gratitude for what he has already experienced in his life, verse 30 says, he went off and he had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. $10. Well, unfortunately, we're not a lot unlike that man, folks. Because if someone has wronged us, sometimes we want them to suffer. We want them to hurt as bad as they've hurt us. And we put people in prison in various ways. We might use the silent treatment on them. Well, I'm just not going to talk to them because they offended me, okay? We may simply avoid them totally. Or we may launch a volley of verbal assaults against them. I would ask you this morning, are you holding someone hostage right now? Are you holding someone hostage? Are you trying to make that person feel miserable because of what they've done? Well, let's pick up the story again to see what happens. This forgiven servant makes a critical mistake. He throws his friend into prison. And someone saw what had happened, and they reported it to the king. How could this forgiven man be so unforgiving? He had been the recipient of such mercy and such grace. The king hears about it, and the king gets ticked off. And he sends for this servant who he had forgiven. And in verses 32 through 34, we read this. He says, "You wicked servant, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" In anger, his master turned him over to the torturers until he paid back all that he owed. And I've often thought about that, how is he ever going to pay that back? But what happened to that man will happen, I think, to each one of us unless we learn to forgive. Unless we learn how to set the standard of grace. The torturers will come and take us away if we don't extend forgiveness to those who have wronged us. And you say, well, what torturers? Well, maybe that's those hidden torturers of anger and bitterness that eat away from the inside of us. Maybe it's the torture of frustration and malice that give us ulcers or high blood pressure or migraine headaches or lower back pain. Maybe it's the hidden tortures that make us lie awake at night stewing over every wrong that person did to us. The torturers of an unforgiven heart who stalk us day and night, and suck every bit of joy out of our lives. All because we are not willing to forgive. Now, while we often try to punish and imprison those who hurt us, I think the reverse actually happens. When we don't forgive, we end up being tortured. Sometimes the worst person in the entire world is the person with an unforgiving heart. Some of the most miserable people I know in the world are those who are unwilling to forgive others. Maybe you've heard the story, it's been around for a while, but two men who were in the nursing home. And they've been quarreling for years. They've been friends for forever. But they've been quarreling over the years, just over everything. It just had always been at odds with one another. And one of the guys finally thought he was on his deathbed. And so he called this foe, his enemy, over to his deathbed, and he says, what he thinks is his deathbed, and he says, "John," he says, "I want you to know I forgive you of everything. Everything that you've said and done over the years. And I'm asking you to do the same for me." The other man, with tears in his eyes, agreed that he too would like to be forgiven, and he would like to forgive this man. And then the man in the bed, the first guy, says, "But if I get better, this doesn't count." I think that's the way we kind of look at forgiveness sometimes. Folks, let's not put off forgiveness. Don't allow the root of bitterness to grow into a tree of hatred or resentment. Lewis Smead said this, "When I genuinely forgive, I set a prisoner free and then discover that the prisoner I set free was me." And that's so true. The Bible is very clear on what we are to do when someone has wronged us. Jesus put it this way in verse 15. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. So, when we need forgiveness, when you need forgiveness in your life, I would say again there's some action steps we need to take. Number one, again, we need to meet that person face to face. Secondly, we need to point out what we thought was wrong, the wrong action or the offense, whatever. And thirdly, we need to just release that person. Say, I forgive you. It's over. To forgive a person is a process of giving up. Giving up what we think they owe us or they owe somebody. That's what the word forgiveness really means. It means to give to someone by releasing them from the debt. It also carries the idea of releasing and freeing ourselves. And when we cancel the debt, we give up demands for perfect behavior on their part. We give up demands for perfect justice. We give up demands for perfect retribution. To forgive is to give grace to another person and freedom to ourselves. We're a lot like the unforgiving man in the story that Jesus told, because our sins were kind of like that $25 million that he owed, that debt that he could never repay. We have that same debt that we could never repay. And yet, unwarranted by his grace, God sent his Son, Jesus, that we celebrated this morning in communion, to pay off all of our spiritual debts. And Colossians 3:13 tells us that we are to forgive as the Lord forgave us. Unmerited, full of grace. Ernest Hemingway, in his short story, The Capital of the World, writes of a father and son who had stopped talking to one another. Things got so bad that the son left home, and they never talked to each other for a number of years. And after a number of years, the father wanted to mend the relationship. So he went around everywhere trying to find his son, wherever he was. He came to the capital city of Madrid, and he decided to go to the newspaper office and take out a big ad. And the ad said simply this: Paco, please meet me at 12 noon tomorrow in front of the newspaper office. All is forgiven. I love you, your father. The next day at 12 noon, there were 800 men named Paco standing in front of the newspaper building. I suspect this morning that there may be some Pacos here today in need of forgiveness, as well as some who need to give the gift of forgiveness to others. How about you this morning? Do you need to ask somebody for forgiveness? Remember that that's all forgiveness is. It's a gift. Forgiveness is a gift. They don't have to earn it. They don't deserve it. We give it freely. Maybe we're tired of living with that venom in us, of that unforgiving spirit. Maybe our grudges are structuring the total outlook of our lives. I say this morning, let's cancel the debt, shall we? Let's cancel the debt. Restore that friendship this morning by being a grace giver. Maybe you need God's forgiveness today. Maybe you're here this morning and you need God's forgiveness in your life. C.S. Lewis has said, to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. And as Christians, I say this morning again, let's set the standard. Let's set the standard of grace, of forgiveness in our communities and in our culture. Let's be an example of Jesus to the world around us. Can you say amen?